So Mike Graham, out of the goodness of his heart, made an appointment for me to go and work out with Hiro Matsuda. When the time came, I met Matsuda down at his gym. I was actually going to get a shot at becoming a professional wrestler. How cool was that? Man, was I naive. What I didn't know was that Matsuda was pissed off having to be there that day. He was wrestling 6 days a week, and this was the one day he wasn't scheduled to wrestle. So basically, I was taking him away from his day off. Hell, I'd have been pissed too. The first thing he did was get me outside the ring and exercise me. I thought I was in good shape going in, but I quickly found out otherwise. Weightlifting shape is one thing, wrestling shape is another. So it didn't take long for Matsuda to get me to the point where I thought I was going to faint. Everything was turning white and my knees felt like rubber. I told Matsuda I was liable to go down at any second. All right, he said, now it's time to wrestle. So he threw me in the ring. Before I knew it, Matsuda was sitting between my legs and putting his elbow in the middle of my shin. Then he grabbed the end of my toe and twisted my foot until, crack, my shin broke in half. The whole thing took about 2 seconds, and my damn leg was broken. I couldn't even get myself home. I had an Econoline van at the time with a clutch in it, and there was no way I could drive it with a broken leg. I had to wait until my dad came home from work, and I could call him and tell him what happened. I was hurt and confused. I didn't know why Matsuda had done that to me. I had a lot to learn. In those days, more than 25 years ago, wrestling was a very barbaric and protective business. The attitude was, why would we let anybody like you into this elite club of ours just because you lifted weights for a couple of years? What gives you the right to be part of this? Today you get a pair of wrestling boots for Christmas and you call yourself a wrestler. Back then you had to give up everything, even to have a shot. If you had a family, a wife and kids, you had to leave it all behind. At the time, I felt betrayed. I wound up living in a hotel room down the street from my parents' house, a place called the Crossway Inn. It was cheap, only about $10 a day to live there. I remember when my dad would go to work, I would go limp over to their house and my mom would feed me. And when the time came for my dad to come home, I would get the hell out of there on my crutches and go back to the hotel. All in all, I had my leg in a cast for about 10 weeks. By the time my cast came off and my leg felt better, I knew what I was going to do. I went right back down to Matsuda's gym with a completely different attitude. He beat me again, of course, but when my opponent tried to break my leg this time, I blocked it and stopped him. And all of a sudden they began looking at me a little differently, like I was something more to them than a damn wishbone. They had me come down to the sportatorium after that, and every day Matsuda and the other guys beat me up. They chipped my teeth and tore a bunch of muscles, and twisted my knee and screwed up my neck, and stretched every ligament in my body. They did about everything you can do to a person. After 3 months, they figured out I wasn't going to quit, and their attitudes changed a little. It wasn't that they lightened up on me. I mean, they were still beating the living crap out of me. I was still their whipping boy in their punching bag, but at least I didn't see that animosity and hatred in their eyes every time they got a hold of me. So I hung in there. And a whole year went by, and I still wasn't any closer to becoming a professional wrestler than the day Matsuda posted my leg and broke it. Finally, I didn't think I could take it any longer. I was thinking about quitting when Eddie Graham called me up at home. Terry, he said, I'm going to be there tomorrow and I'm going to work out with you. I want to show you a few things. Eddie Graham was a former Southern heavyweight champion. I said to myself, oh God, what are they going to do to me now? So with all my misgivings, I went down there and I trained with Eddie Graham, but it wasn't at all what I expected. Hiro Matsuda had taught me a bunch of submission holds, holds that make your opponent give up because he can't stand the pain. If I locked up with a guy, I was supposed to try to take his arm off. That's what I'd been told to do for the last year. I was supposed to take my opponent's arm and post it behind him or try to wrench it out of his socket. That's what I thought wrestling was about. I thought you were supposed to be as brutal as possible because that's what it took to win. All of a sudden, Eddie Graham told me I wasn't going to need any of that stuff anymore. When you grab a guy's arm, he said, don't twist it off. Instead of really hurting him, just slide your grip around his wrist. It's up to him to make faces and yell and scream like you're killing him. I looked at him like he was from Mars or something. And when you put somebody in a headlock, Eddie Graham said, don't try to give him a cauliflower ear. Grab him with a soft part of your arm against his ear so you won't hurt him. Why am I not trying to hurt him, I asked. That's when he told me the truth, that you weren't fighting somebody in the ring, you were cooperating, working together to put on a show. And instead of the tougher guy winning, the outcome was determined in advance. I was in shock, brother, total shock. I felt like I'd been betrayed. For the last year, I'd been getting the crap beat out of me, learning how to hurt people and keep from getting myself hurt. What I didn't know was Eddie Graham and the others thought I was going to be somebody special in this business. I had an attitude they'd never seen before. I wouldn't quit, so they wanted to make sure I knew what I was doing. I wrestled for a while as the Super Destroyer, but the small-time stuff frustrated me so much that I left the business to run a gym and a nightclub. But after a while, I knew the truth. I had to get back in the ring. One day I called a wrestler who I'd become friends with, superstar Billy Graham. I said, "Hey man, I've been training for a year, and now I think I'm bigger than you are." By then my arms were 24 inches around. They were huge. Billy Graham didn't believe me. He said he had the largest arms in the world. But I said, "No, I think I'm bigger than you." "Well," he said, "if you're that big, I'm going to make a phone call." And he called a guy named Louis Tillett in Pensacola, Florida. In those days, the whole country was divided up into very distinct, very closely guarded territories. The Worldwide Wrestling Federation, which was run by Vince McMahon Sr., stretched from Maine to Maryland. The Crockett promotion had the Carolinas. Jerry Lawler and Jerry Jarrett had Tennessee. Georgia was a territory. Florida was a territory. Kansas City was a territory. And San Francisco and Los Angeles each represented a territory. Texas was actually a few territories, and one of the biggest was the American Wrestling Association, AWA, which a guy named Vern Gagne ran out of Minneapolis. Louis Tillett ran the Pensacola, Alabama territory, which included Pensacola and Panama City in northern Florida, and Dothan, New Brunswick, and Mobile in Alabama. With the help of my buddy, superstar Billy Graham, I got booked on that circuit. In the Pensacola, Alabama territory, I wasn't the Super Destroyer anymore. I was slated to wrestle as a good guy named Terry Boulder, which was a play on my real name. The wrestling audience was used to big 250 to 400-pound guys with big beer bellies and hair all over their bodies who didn't work out with weights the way I did. So to the wrestling world, I was Charles Atlas and Hercules rolled into one. And the fans were told I came from Venice Beach, California, which made me a god to the people in Dothan and Mobile. It made them think I was something I wasn't. While I was still wrestling for Louis Tillett, I showed up at a morning talk show in Alabama to promote a wrestling event. The other guest was a guy named Lou Ferrigno, who was starring with Bill Bixby on a TV show called The Incredible Hulk. Ferrigno was traveling around the country to plug his series, which wasn't doing so well in the ratings. So in between shooting schedules, they kept him on the road, working all the local markets. When I got on the show, the host looked at Lou Ferrigno, and he looked at me and he said, "Oh my God, you're bigger than Lou Ferrigno. You're bigger than the Hulk." And I said, "That's because I am the real Hulk." I had the gift of gab, and Lou had a bit of a speech impediment at the time as a result of a hearing loss, and I didn't want to run him down, but I did have the upper hand and I ran with it a little. Plus, the host did my job for me. "Gosh," he said, "your arms are so much bigger than his. It looks like if you arm wrestled him, you'd break his arm." Actually, Lou Ferrigno was an unbelievable specimen, a real dedicated bodybuilder, and his arms were in much better shape than mine. But I had more bulk on me and my clothes were probably tighter, so I looked larger. That night when I got to the arena and went back to the locker room, all the boys started calling me the Hulk. They said they saw me on television and that I was bigger than Lou Ferrigno, and the name just stuck. I wasn't exclusive to Louis Tillett, so I wrestled for a couple of other outfits in between runs in the Pensacola, Alabama territory. One of them was the partnership of Jerry Jarrett and Jerry Lawler, which operated out of Memphis, Tennessee. Jerry Lawler was like a god in Memphis. At times, he was as popular as Elvis. He even ran for mayor there as a joke. He didn't lift a finger to promote his campaign, and he came in third in a 15-candidate race. It was in Tennessee that I was known as Terry the Hulk Boulder and won my first championship belt. I wasn't Hulk Hogan quite yet, but I was getting there. In 1979, I took another break from wrestling to earn some big money on the docks in Tampa. I was enjoying a regular 9-to-5 job and taking home good bread when all of a sudden I got a call from my old friend, Terry Funk. Terry was a big name in the wrestling business, a second-generation wrestler who had already been a National Wrestling Alliance world champion. One day he came down to the docks and said, "What the hell is wrong with you? You could be the biggest star in the wrestling business." I said, "What? Are you crazy? I'm not interested in wrestling anymore. I've tried it 2 or 3 times now and I can't make any money at it." On top of that, I told him I didn't like the wrestling lifestyle. I didn't like all the drinking, the hell-raising, the atmosphere. I just wanted to stay home now. Terry Funk said, "Well, there's this guy in New York, this promoter, who heard about you when you were in the Pensacola, Alabama territory and when you were in the Memphis territory. He heard that wherever you would wrestle, the arenas would be sold out, and the crowd really responded to you. And he wants to see you. His name is Vince McMahon." This was Vince McMahon Sr., the current Vince's dad. I didn't know the name, and I told Terry Funk I still wasn't interested, and I figured that would be the end of it. But the next day, Terry called me at home and asked me to come down to the Florida wrestling office. I didn't want to go, but I couldn't say no to him. When I got there, it wasn't just Terry Funk waiting for me. Jack and Jerry Briscoe were there too, and so was Eddie Graham and his son Mike. They all said I needed to talk with Vince McMahon. I still wasn't completely convinced, but they got me to say I'd talk to him. So they called Vince McMahon Sr. and put him on the speakerphone. Vince said, "I want you to come up north next week." I was a real horse's ass. I said, "I'll come up, but I'm not bringing my wrestling stuff. I'll come up and talk to you, but I don't want to wrestle." Looking back, it didn't make any sense for me to say that. Hell, I was making the trip anyway. But those were the conditions I made, and Vince McMahon Sr. accepted them. So I flew up north. But as it turned out, they didn't bring me to New York. They brought me to Allentown, Pennsylvania. The reason I went to Allentown is that the McMahon promotion used to tape his TV shows up there. When I arrived, Vince McMahon Sr. had his son Vince Jr. and all the wrestlers and their managers in one dressing room, and they were talking about what they were going to do in front of the cameras. I remembered Vince Sr. had these little teeny glasses, bifocals that he would slide down onto the end of his nose, and he would look over the top of them at you. Another thing I remember is he always had 4 quarters in his hand that he would click together. And if he wanted to, he could just stare a hole through you. After I got to know him, I realized he was one of the best guys in the world. If you ever had a problem, you could go to him. And he was the first person I'd ever met who would always make good on his promises. If he told you something, it would happen every single time. Later on, Vince Sr. took me aside and talked to me one-on-one. I told him I really wasn't into wrestling anymore. I told him I got homesick and I didn't like being on the road all the time. I just didn't like the lifestyle. But Vince McMahon said, "If you come up here and give this a try, I guarantee you won't regret it." So I flew back to Tampa, packed up my car, and headed to New York to join the Worldwide Wrestling Federation. But during my first meeting with Vince McMahon Sr., he mentioned that he had an idea. He was going to change my wrestling name from Terry the Hulk Boulder to Hulk Hogan. Why? Because they had Bruno Sammartino for the Italian Americans, Chief Jay Strongbow for the Native Americans, Ivan Putski for the Polish Americans, and Pedro Morales for the Puerto Rican Americans, but they didn't have anyone to represent the Irish Americans. So I was going to be the great Irish hope. The funny thing is, I didn't have a single drop of Irish blood in me, my dad being Italian and my mother being part French, part Italian, and part Panamanian. Anyway, Vince Sr. gave me 2 bottles of red dye and told me to dye my hair red. And when I was done, I was supposed to look Irish. Fred Blassie, a wrestling manager and a close friend of Vince McMahon, went back to my hotel with me to supervise the dye job. Now, Vince had told me this was the same stuff his wife used on her hair and it wouldn't have any bad effects. But the more I thought about it, the more I was afraid that it would make my hair fall out. Finally, I told Fred, "I'm going bald-headed the way it is. If I put this on my hair, it's all over. I'll be a pumpkin with a big bald spot on my head." So I poured the dye Vince had given me down the toilet. Fred just freaked out. He said, "Oh my God, you're dead. You're fired. You're never going to work here." But when I went to tell Vince Sr. about it, he didn't react nearly as negatively as Fred Blassie thought he would. He said, "Okay, we'll go with it the way it is and see how it works." And that was the end of the red hair experiment. But it was the beginning of Hulk Hogan.